Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and I wanted to take a moment today and talk about a topic that's been making the rounds in the Wonders of the First community over the last few weeks, and that's the idea of sideboards coming to the game. Now, for those of you who don't know, Wonders of the First is typically a best of one game. It is not a best of three game. There are no sideboards in the game right now. But for those of you who have played other games before coming to Wonders of the First, it might feel a little weird not having access to a sideboard because it's become such a staple, such a normal expected thing in other card games. And I've seen a lot of discussion happening on the Discord channel between people talking about if they're necessary, how you could implement them, if there's something you should actually do, if the DBS system should take sideboards into account, and all of that stuff. So I wanted to just kind of go over my thoughts on sideboards and where I sort of stand with the game for someone that's been playing the game for about a year now non-stop and has had a ton of experience playing. The first thing that I want to mention is that it's incredibly difficult to actually implement a sideboard in a game like this. One thing that's special about Wonders of the First is the fact that it was designed to be sort of the perfect game length. It's specifically 7 rounds, the game can't end any sooner than 7 rounds, and it can't be extended any longer than 7 rounds. And it's supposed to last the optimal game length so that everyone feels like they got to do what their deck is supposed to do. You don't have some of the problems in other games where the game is ending super soon before your deck got to do its thing, or maybe you're playing against a control deck and they get to drag out the game forever and make it take forever for the game to end when you should have lost many, many moons ago. Because of that, there isn't really room for best of 3 in the same way that other games do it. If you were to play 3 games of Wonders of the First at a tournament with an opponent, with every opponent for every round of the tournament would go way too long. It would never end. One of the things that I've heard people talk about is maybe doing best of 3 just in the top 8. But even just doing it in the top 8 still extends the length of the tournament to unrealistic levels, I feel, and it's just super hard to try and figure out how to make best of 3 work inside a game like Wonders of the First, where it's designed around one game lasting the optimal game length, which is typically about the same amount of time as other games' best of 3s. Because of that, it gets really, really hard to think about how sideboards would be implemented if you can't do best of 3. And I've heard a lot of different options, a lot of different ideas in the community. Some people are saying that you should know everybody's deck lists right up front, and you should be able to sideboard before game 1 and adapt your deck based on the deck list that you're facing. I think that idea is a little inelegant and kind of clumsy, because you could start getting people that build their sideboard specifically to sort of replace the expectations of their opponent and adapt their deck into something that now their opponent is sideboarded against the main deck thing that is maybe sideboarded out and not even in the deck again. And it just gets really, really messy, I think, if you're able to bring in cards before game 1 and change your whole deck around based on your opponent's deck list. You could definitely take advantage of that and abuse that system in ways that I think aren't going to feel good for the normal player. It's also just an extra layer of sort of inelegancy where you have to be good at knowing your opponent's deck before you've ever even played against it and knowing exactly what to do. I just think it's not really a great answer. The other option that I've heard people come up with is, instead of doing sideboards at all, you could just have 3 different decks that you need to register, and you need to win with 2 of those decks, or something to that degree. And again, that kind of goes back to best of 3 not being super realistic. And even if you did do best of 3 in the top 8 and only the top 8, which I still don't think is very realistic, I think the tournament probably runs too late even just doing that, it does create this divide where the lesser experienced players that haven't been making it to the top 8 don't really have any experience playing that way. And then if they do finally manage to place in the top 8 for their first time, it kind of feels like they're playing a whole different format that they've never done before against probably seasoned veterans that are used to it. It just feels like you can come in at an advantage. It feels to me like whatever the system is for the whole tournament, it should just be that for the whole tournament. And that's on top of the fact that I don't think it's really realistic to play best of 3 in the top 8 anyway, because there's just it's just gonna take so long, to be completely honest. It's gonna take an insane amount of time to finish all of those games to finally get to your finals and then finish your finals match. I don't think it's realistic, especially when it comes to just your normal everyday tournaments, and not like the crazy like championships, world championships, or anything like that. And I do think it's important to have sort of like a consistent expectation of what the tournament's going to be. I don't think you should have like the really big tournaments where there's a lot on the line be different format-wise or formatting-wise than what your normal everyday tournament might be at your LGS or something like that. So I don't think doing like 3 different 50-card decks is really the answer as well. I think it's incredibly difficult to implement any kind of best of 3 in Wonders of the First, and therefore incredibly difficult to implement any kind of sideboard. Some of the other options that kind of have been considered or tossed around is maybe being able to sideboard mid-game. If you're playing just best of 1, but maybe each player has like a timeout they can call at any point in the game, and they can shuffle cards from their sideboard into their deck, and they're in there for the rest of the game. But I also don't think that's very smart, because that favors decks that have a lot of card draw. If you can do something like that, the decks that are much more consistently able to draw into those new answers, those sideboard options, better than their opponents, are going to have an edge, where they're going to make much more use out of their sideboard cards, and your opponent has to be lucky enough to kind of draw into them organically without all the extra support from other card draw spells. So I don't think something like that would work super well either. I don't think there's really a very clean, elegant, efficient way to make sideboards happen in best of 1, and I don't think best of 3 can really exist really at all in Wonders of the First, because like I said, the game length just seems to be tailored to be the perfect game length, and it doesn't allow much wiggle room for a best of 3 scenario. But another thing that I want to talk about, the next thing that I think comes to mind, other than how difficult it would be to implement this and the different ways you could implement it, and how none of them are quite worth it in the end, is this. I think Wonders of the First is actually one of the games that needs a sideboard the least out of pretty much all of the card games I've ever played. Wonders of the First is designed in a way where it's really, really hard to take over the game completely with bomby plays. And that's due to 2 different aspects of the game that are sort of unique to this game. Not completely unique, but for the most part unique. The first of which is the fact that Wonders of the First uses this lanes or realms sort of system to how it works. You have 7 different realms by the end of the game, and action can take place across all 7 realms, and you only need to control more stones than your opponent. So you don't need to win every single realm or lane in order to win the game. You need to pick your battles and win just enough to have more stones, more realms that are under your control than your opponent has. Because of that, it's a lot harder to make a bomby play and have it just straight up win the game outright. If you make some kind of crazy bomb play in, round 7 in realm 7, and you take over realm 7, and it's such a crazy play that you have no chance of taking that realm back, you still have 6 other realms. You still have other places you can fight over. You don't need realm 7 to win. You can win the majority of stones in the other realms and still end up winning the game. And so, because of that, bomby plays don't feel as problematic in this game as they typically do in other games like Magic the Gathering, where you're only playing to one play space, and if you make a crazy bomb play that takes over the game, it literally takes over the game, not just one realm. So that's the first way, in that I think sideboards are less necessary for this game, because there are ways to just pivot and not care about whatever realm they do the crazy big thing in that you would normally want to sideboard against. The other thing that I want to bring up is how everything in Wonders of the First is telegraphed. There is no instant speed response to anything that your opponent's doing. In a lot of other games, most notably Magic the Gathering, you can respond to things that your opponent's doing. You can stop what they're doing in their tracks in the moment that they're doing it and really just blow up their entire plan. But with Wonders of the First, you take an action, your opponent takes an action. You take an action, your opponent takes an action. Because there's no responding to what your opponent does, every single thing they do is telegraphed. You see the thing that they put onto the field before they have an opportunity to do stuff with it. So you always have a window to find an answer, or to get out in front of it, or to maybe put your own pressure into a different realm so that maybe they're taking advantage of the thing they just put out. But if they do, they're not able to stop you from taking advantage of the thing that you put out. The combination of having 7 different realms and not needing to control all of them to win, and also not having direct responses to what your opponents can do, and having to telegraph everything you're doing and giving your opponent time to just find what they need or deal with it or get out in front of it. They put a big, huge thing in a realm, and now they get to take it with their next action. You get an action first. You put another big, huge thing there, they can't swing in. So because of those 2 different factors, it's really, really just not as necessary, I feel, to have a sideboard in a game like this, because you're not faced with the same sorts of problems that other games are plagued by. Now, that doesn't mean you're never gonna have things pop up that you wish you had sideboard answers to. That's just always going to be an inevitability. There's always going to be stuff that seems super powerful that if you had just the right answer would be way, way more efficient than maybe what's in your normal deck. But I don't think it's as problematic as other games. And I think the combination of it being so much harder to implement in a game like this and so much less necessary in a game like this compared to other games makes it just seem sort of unrealistic to expect any sort of sideboarding coming to the game anytime soon. One example that I want to use as a bomby play that isn't necessarily stuck in just one realm that could potentially be an issue is like the Omnis Quantum combo. For those of you who don't know, Omnis Quantum is a wonder that ascends at the beginning of round 7 if they're out before round 7. When they ascend at the beginning of round 7, they have an ability that triggers where they get to name odd or even, and their opponents can't play any cards that have the energy cost of whatever they named. So, if you play an Omnis Quantum by the end of round 6, and then you start round 7, you can cut off half of the cards your opponent can play. Maybe potentially more if you're smart enough to name the right, odds or evens depending on the deck you're up against. But where it gets crazy is there is another card in the game called Lunar Empowerment. And Lunar Empowerment allows you to trigger ascend abilities an additional time. So the way the combo works is you ascend, you cut off half the cards your opponent can play, and then with your very first action, you use Lunar Empowerment, you ascend again, and you pick whatever you didn't pick the first time, and now your opponent can't play anything for the rest of round 7. Which is kind of crazy. And if your opponent gets to that point and they manage to cut you off, it does feel super balmy in a way where you wish you had a sideboard answer. But it's also another example of the fact that you can get out in front of this. Even if they wait until the very last action of round 6 so that you don't see it coming, and then they drop the Omnis Quantum, trying to prepare it to ascend at the beginning of round 7, all you need is one untapped land and any answer in your hand whatsoever. You can harvest your land, get an action back, pass, and then when it comes back to you, you can use that action to use your removal spell, get rid of the Omnis Quantum, and they can never put you in that position. Now, it does mean that you need to play sort of reactively. You need to keep in mind everything that your opponent's deck could potentially be doing and have the energy held up, have the cards still in your hand, and not waste them on plays earlier in the game in order to make sure that doesn't happen. But I think that's just part of the game. That's sort of how the game functions in general. This game is all about getting in front of your opponent, anticipating all of the different lines they could possibly do over the next 6, 7, however many actions, and trying to make sure you're prepared for the worst possible scenario out of all of those. That's where the fun comes. That's where the strategy and the talent in playing this game truly comes from. So the fact that the game expects you to do that on a regular basis without a sideboard to sort of replace the idea of a sideboard while you're playing through your best of one game just kind of meshes with everything the game already is. So I do think it can be tricky. There can definitely be some cards that feel like you wish you had a sideboard option in a game 2. But I think for the most part, the really good players are going to be able to get in front of that stuff, anticipate it, and have answers to things when they need them because they know what's coming. You know, they have enough experience with the game that they know what's coming. And for the rest of us that don't, that's something to strive for. That's something to build to. And like I said before, I think this game more than any other game probably requires a sideboard the least, because I think there are the least amount of those problematic cards or combos that seem so devastating that they do require some kind of sideboard-ish answer. I think those are going to be extremely few and far between, and the beauty of this game is you have the DBS system. So even if those things do become super problematic, they can scale up the point value of those cards so that it makes your deck overall a lot weaker if you want to include those cards in your deck. And I think that's just really interesting. And the more and more I think about this problem, the more I just kind of end up at the same conclusion, which is just that sideboards, even though they would be nice, and even though, you know, on our gut level, it feels like they should be there because we're just so used to it from other games. I really do think that Wonders of the First gives us an opportunity to have a game where it's just not as necessary. And that doesn't mean, like I said before, that you'll never encounter a situation where you wish you had a sideboard or a way to deal with it, for sure. But like I said, I think as far as the great scope of games out there and all of the games that are available, I think Wonders of the First is designed in a way where it probably needs a sideboard the least amount out of any of them, and I'm kind of grateful for that. The last thing that I want to talk about before I end this video is the fact that I think sort of a pseudo sideboard is already kind of starting to crop up within the game organically, even though it's not technically really a sideboard. And let me explain what I mean, and that's the token deck. Now, what's interesting about tokens in this game, and most of you that have been playing it already know this, but if you have a card that creates a token, you can use any token that you have in your collection that meets the criteria of the card. So if the card just says create a dragon token, if you have a token that's a dragon and a plant, you can make that. If you have a token that's a dragon and a warrior, you can make that. If you have a token that's a dragon with flying, you could make that, as long as you can just make a dragon token. The only way you wouldn't be able to make the dragon token with flying is if the card making the dragon token specifically said without flying, and you wouldn't be able to choose that. Because of the way tokens work in this game, some of the better tokens have a DBS value assigned to them, where if you include them in your token deck as things that you can actually create, and you pull them out into the game, it's going to cost DBS value. It's going to make the DBS value of your deck go up, and you have to be smart to allot some of your DBS to those token cards in order to have access to them in your deck. And I think that's really, really cool. And for those of us who don't have any of those actual token cards, and we're just using like a quarter to represent a dragon token, that's fine. You don't lose anything. You get everything that's printed on the card that made the token. Whatever it says you get on that token, you get. It's just, if you have tokens that are that and more, you have the potential to grab those tokens, as long as it meets the initial requirements of everything that the token creator says it needs to be, at the very least. And that's super interesting, and why I think token decks matter as far as being potentially a pseudo sideboard is because They kind of already are. I'm going to give you an example. If you create dragon tokens in your deck, and maybe you have cards that buff up all plants in your deck, you can grab dragon plants as your tokens. You can make those tokens, and now they're going to get all of those synergies of getting buffed up by your things that buff up plants. And that's super cool. But what if you're playing against a deck that has a card that destroys all plants? And you start to realize as you're playing, oh, he's in the right color, he's in the right orbital, it seems like he might have that card. You can start to pivot your strategy, and you can access other tokens. You can grab a dragon warrior or a dragon Viking or anything that's not a dragon plant. You could grab your dragon with flying that isn't a plant, because you're trying to pivot away from using plants to get away from his potential cards that destroy all plants. But in a completely different scenario against another deck, maybe they have something that destroys all wonders without flying. So in that scenario, you start to realize they're in the right colors, they're in the right orbital, they're playing all things with flying. It's probably likely they have that card that destroys all things without flying, and you can start to pull out your dragon tokens that have flying instead to make sure that you avoid that. So you already sort of have a pseudo sideboard situation built into the game where your deck can adapt based on what the opponent's deck is and play differently and do different things with their tokens based on what deck they're up against. Now, at this point, the value that tokens add is very negligible. The differences in the tokens is very, very negligible. Mostly just wonder types, like what their lineage is, what their class is, that sort of thing. Gaining access to like tribal buffs or debuffs or stuff like that. There is a little bit more nuance to it. There is flying on some of the tokens and stuff like that. But still, even now, with just the little negligible bits of value that are tacked onto these tokens, there are ways you could pivot. And I only see that getting stronger and more in-depth as the game goes. Even if the developers aren't intending for token decks to be used that way and aren't intending for token decks to feel like sideboards, I think inevitably, at the very least, they're going to tiptoe and creep closer and closer towards feeling like that, just naturally, organically over time, no matter what. Because as more cards that make tokens are implemented, and all of those cards have access to the full breadth of tokens that have been released in every set, you're just going to have more options, just organically. Also, as you start to release more tokens set after set, you have even more options for what tokens you're grabbing. And eventually, I can only imagine the design space is going to go beyond just simply having wonder types, the lineage and the class, and maybe flying on a card to have more there. We've also already seen token lands that are printed on the back of every single token card in Packs of Wonders of the First. And those are mainly supposed to be used to put in your deck in Limited, so that if you need more lands, you have access to them. But who's to say there might not be some kind of token card in the future that allows you to pull one of those unknown orbital token lands out of your token deck and maybe get access to it while you're playing. Anything is possible. And I don't necessarily think that they're specifically going to try to build the token deck in the direction of becoming a sort of pseudo sideboard. I don't necessarily think that's the plan, although I don't know for sure. This is just me hypothesizing and theorizing. But I think inevitably, even if they're not planning on going that direction, it's just going to happen organically. I think little by little, there are going to be things introduced, both cards that can make tokens and actual new tokens that are introduced, that just start to increase the options of what the token deck is capable of, and the ways in which the token deck allows you to pivot mid-game with the kind of tokens you can grab out of it. And to me, that's actually super exciting. I think the longer the game goes on, the more sets are released, the more that token deck starts to feel like just a little bit like a sideboard. It's never going to fully feel like a sideboard. They'd be crazy to give you access to like ridiculous, crazy hard pivots that have answers to any possible meta deck that could pop up just by playing a card and pulling the answer out of your sideboard. We're not looking for like the magic equivalent of wishes or anything like that. That's too far. But like I said, I do think inevitably, little by little, that token deck is going to creep closer and closer towards feeling like a pseudo sideboard in some ways, and I do think there's some interesting design space to explore there. So to wrap up this video, my thoughts are simply this. There are a lot of interesting ideas on how to implement sideboards, ways to implement things that feel like sideboards, like doing the 3 different decks that you register at a tournament and having to win with multiple decks, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, I think all of the ideas for potentially implementing sideboards or something that can replace the feel of sideboards are all just too unrealistic. I think they're all just too pie in the sky pipe dream. I think they require way too much on the part of the player, especially if we expect new players to get into this. And I think lugging around 3 decks is a lot to ask for any player. And I think trying to just shoehorn sideboards into a best of 1, or somehow trying to make best of 3 work in a game that's clearly designed over, you know, being best of 1 itself, I just don't think any of it's really going to work. It's an interesting thought experiment, and I can understand people's gut reactions and urge to want to have sideboards, because that's just what most of the other games do. And I think anybody that's coming from another game is so used to that it just feels weird and wrong to not have access to that. But the more I think about it, the harder it is to implement, and the less necessary it is to actually have, because I think the game is designed so well in a way where it's just not as necessary to have that sideboard in a game like this. I think the token deck is going to be seriously crazy interesting to see how deep that goes and how that starts to evolve with set to set to set, and I'm super excited to look forward to that. But let me know in the comments what you guys think about my ideas, if you disagree with me, if you agree with me, if you have an idea about a sideboard option or something to replace a sideboard that I haven't brought up in this video. I'm super curious to hear the community's thoughts on all of this. And especially super interested to hear your thoughts on how I envision token decks moving forward. Because I think, like I said before, at the very least, even if they don't intend it to, I think the token deck is just naturally, organically going to start to give you some of those options to pivot what your deck is doing mid-game based on whatever you're up against, just because that's the nature of getting decisions as far as to what tokens you grab. That's just kind of part of the deal. So, super interested. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.